Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to this fifth series of the webinar organized by Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, UNESCO, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and International Center for Integrated Water Source Management under the auspices of UNESCO. Thank you so much for being with us. Today's seminar will be on the title Climate Risk Assessment on Hydropower within the framework of series of webinar Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches Adaptation in an Age of Uncertainty. My name is Anil Mishra from the section on Hydrological System and Water Scarcity Division of Water Sciences. We have today in this series of fifth webinar, we will touch upon hydropower related issues and we will have a two speaker who will bring the perspective from Sri Lanka and Nepal. First speaker, Kelsey Harfam, water sources engineer, will present her experience implementing a comprehensive analysis of infrastructure vulnerability in transport, water, and energy sector by integrating a top-down climate science approach with a bottom-up stakeholder-driven approach in Sri Lanka, Kelani River Basin, followed by Divas Basnet from NDRI, Nepal Development Research Institute, will discuss his work assessing future impact of climate change on Nepal's hydroelectricity sector and associated findings. Followed by, we will have a Q&A session. You are welcome to put your question in the Q&A section of this webinar. And there will be a panel session in which Dr. Peter Roser and Divya Shrestha from NDRI will join together with the two speakers. And finally, we will have a closing remark by Dr. Will Logan from Integrated Center for Integrated Water Sources Management. This is a series of the webinar as we are preparing for a global conference, Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches, scheduled to be held just before COP26. As a contribution to COP26, provided sanitary situation, we want to organize this conference in November here in Paris. So these case studies will be compiled based on your contribution during the webinar and also during the discussion session, will be compiled and will be presented during the global conference. So thank you very much for our co-organizer being with us for this series of webinar, but also preparing for the global conference. I would like to thank all the colleagues from AGWA, ICWAM, UNESCO for preparing this webinar and all the attendees for your interest in the series of webinar. With that, I would like to invite our first speaker, Kelsey Harfam. She is a water source engineer and a planning specialist currently engaged in projects throughout Asia, addressing issue of climate resilient water source management and disaster risk reduction. Her work combines technical elements of water sources engineering with urban policy training and water conflict transformation with diverse international development projects. Kelsey will present case study from Sri Lanka. Kelsey, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, Neil. I'll just get started here. So as Anil mentioned, I'll be presenting a river basin approach to building resilience in critical infrastructure. This case study is in the Kelani River Basin in Sri Lanka. This was completed under a broader project, Building Climate Change Resilience in Asia's Critical Infrastructure, which was funded by the Asian Development Bank. And I also want to acknowledge that I know a lot of you may have attended the previous webinar session, where there was also a presentation that looked at water supply and distribution in Colombo based on the Kelani River. So I hope that this presentation today will continue to build on that work and present a broader framework for increasing the, let me get this out of here. increasing resilience of infrastructure and communities in that area. So we're talking about critical infrastructure. Why are we taking a river basin approach? For hydropower, in part that's obvious, but we also want to think about critical infrastructure complexes. So a river basin approach acknowledges the inherent physical, geographical, and functional relationships of ecosystems, but also of the built environment within that river basin. The long-term sustainability of infrastructure, especially in the context of a changing climate, is inextricably linked to effective area-wide planning. On a practical level, the river basin is also the unit already used for most hydrological and hydraulic modeling. And then in the Kelani Basin, along with many others, there are already multi-sector and multi-stakeholder planning efforts to be undertaken, which then can be built off of in the context of infrastructure. And of course, the river basin unit is particularly valuable for managing upstream, downstream connections, both literally in terms of the river and also in terms of infrastructure interdependencies. So the Kelani River Basin is located in the western coast of Sri Lanka. The capital city of Colombo is within the basin and is home to about 25% of the nation's population. There are two distinct parts in the basin: the upper Kelani, which is characterized by steep highland areas and some of the highest rainfall averages in the country. In that upper area, in this figure, you can see a couple of the reservoirs that are part of the hydropower complex. The lower Kelani Basin is much flatter terrain and then includes the urban landscapes leading up to the city of Colombo. So this case study focused on critical infrastructure in the energy, water, and transport sectors. We used thresholds to determine which infrastructure was included in the study, such as capacity of a facility, production volumes, dependent populations, as well as interconnectedness with other infrastructure. Major energy infrastructure includes generation and transmission facilities, as well as the hydropower facilities, which are up in the upper basin. There are, in addition to those reservoirs, which also are part of the water supply complex, there are water intakes and treatment plants. And then this is, of course, the hub of major transportation, road and rail and port networks for the country. So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of critical infrastructure complexes. For this particular case study, we looked at these complexes at two different levels. First, in kind of more sector-specific complexes, for example, the Laksapana hydropower complex, including the storage reservoirs, hydropower plants, and local transmission and distribution infrastructure. The water supply complex, looking at the water intake, treatment plants, distribution, thermal power complex, looking at the thermal plants and their associated infrastructure. Then acknowledging that all of these kind of smaller complexes depend on the Kelani River. They depend on the transport network that's within the basin. So then they all together make up this larger critical infrastructure complex in the Kelani Basin. So we'll zoom in for just a moment on the Laksapana hydropower complex. This is a series of ponds, penstock pipelines, and hydropower plants that make up this complex. Together, they generate over 300 megawatts of power, which is 25% of Sri Lanka's total hydropower capacity and about 8% of total generation in the country. So we'll keep this in mind. Now we're going to look at how we did the vulnerability assessment and how this was implemented using the ICEM climate change adaptation methodology approach. So the CAM, or climate change adaptation methodology, is a flexible methodology for climate change adaptation planning. It's meant to bring a discipline process to vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning to make assumptions and judgments that go into those assessments more transparent. The CAM is fairly straightforward, so it's meant to be implemented by communities or governments. It can be used from an asset to a landscape scale, can be made more complex or simplified. So it's very flexible depending on the inputs that go in. And we really want to emphasize that it focuses on integration with nature and ecosystems. There are three major phases of the CAM: the impact and vulnerability assessment, adaptation planning, and then implementation and feedback. This presentation will focus mainly on the vulnerability assessment, and I'll touch briefly on adaptation planning, but just to recognize that there is that third phase of the cycle. So the CAM approach vulnerability assessment. We look first at threats, which is a hazard, but taking into account as wide of a range as information as possible. And then looking at how those threats impact the selected assets, or in this case, complexes. We look at exposure, sensitivity, and rank those using a system of matrices to then evaluate impact. And then again, with impact and capacity, use that in a matrix system to then assess overall vulnerability. And that vulnerability is then tied to how adaptation planning moves forward. So I'll move through a couple examples of this in a moment, but this is just to present the overall framework for this approach. So after determining the scope and target assets, then conducting the baseline assessment is the next step. So in the CAM process, this integrates historic observations, local expertise and knowledge, GCM results, decision maker interests, information from infrastructure operators, and hydrologic and hydraulic modeling results, among other things. So this is really where we're trying to look at what has been done in terms of that top-down approach and combine it with the bottom-up approach. So for this particular case study, we looked at, we selected first a group of models through a literature review that were the best suited for Sri Lanka based on model calibration and previous analysis. And then two scenarios were selected to represent the extreme wettest, hottest, and extreme coolest, driest scenarios. And this is intended to create a range of reasonable outcomes for future climate change in the basin. And also just to recognize that the GCM results are just one component of this analysis. So just to give an example of that range, here we have southwest monsoon precipitation. This is from the wettest model. You can see that in 2050, there's a projected increase from about 40 to 60%. And then here we have results from the driest model. And this projects a change from -5 to 10% during the same southwest monsoon season. So in addition, again, we used historical flooding records. This particular map is from 2016, which was a significant event in the Kelani Basin. Landslide susceptibility, historical precipitation, temperature, and did site visits, interviews with lots of folks in the basin to get a better understanding of how these things impacted people historically and how they might then change into the future. As an additional component, the WEEP model was used to assess the potential impacts of climate change on water sector infrastructure, particularly the hydropower complex and the river water supply intake locations. And this modeling looked at changes in temperature, precipitation extremes and frequencies, and as well as sea level rise. So climate response surfaces were developed first to analyze overall basin outflow under climate change conditions. So this looks at a delta P versus delta T graph, looking at overall flow in the basin. And so you can also see there are gray dots all over the back of this, and this represents results from 20 out of 21 of the NASA NEXT data set models, and all results for 2030, 2050, and 2080. And then overlaid on this, I have the bounding boxes of those two models that we selected. So the wettest, hottest future scenario, as well as the coldest, driest. And again, that's just to demonstrate in our work with stakeholders kind of the potential future ranges that they might be looking to plan for in infrastructure. So this was also applied looking specifically at hydropower production. This response surface looks at average annual gigawatt hours output in the hydropower facilities. Again, all of the climate models are overlaid. Those are the gray dots on this figure. And then the bounding boxes of the models that we thought are best suited to the area. Red representing the wettest, hottest, and yellow being the driest, coolest future projection. So again, those are kind of all components of our baseline assessment in this approach. And now we'll look at assessing the impacts on specific infrastructure complexes, as well as assessing capacity to avoid or recover from those impacts. So this is an example of how we apply the CAM approach. So this takes a specific threat, in this case, precipitation-induced landslides, looks at the interpretation of the threat, particularly for a future scenario. So looking at, we already know that extreme precipitation events contribute to landslides. Through our modeling, we saw that the number of heavy and very heavy precipitation days is expected to increase in the future. And thus the threat is these precipitation-induced landslides that occur more often in the future. We assessed the Loxapana complex, the hydropower facilities as a whole. And so exposure and sensitivity to those was determined to be medium. And then again, using that matrix approach, the overall impact level is assessed at medium. The impact summary is then just describes a bit more of what that impact expectations are. So for example, direct impacts of landslide events into reservoirs that reduce overall capacity, landslides that damage or destroy transmission towers, and then indirect impacts, landslides that impact roads, restricting travel, obviously impacts to water qualities, as well as overall ecosystem functioning as well. So then adaptive capacity is the next thing evaluated. In this case, it was determined to be medium. And so overall vulnerability of the Loxapana complex to extreme precipitation-induced landslides was determined to be medium. This is just another example I'll go through more quickly. This is also looking at impacts on the Loxapana hydropower complex from droughts, factoring in climate change. Exposure and sensitivity was determined to be high, and therefore impact is high. Adaptive capacity was evaluated to be low, and then overall vulnerability was evaluated as high. Just for a second, we'll also talk about the water supply complex that's based on the river water intakes, as that water obviously is dependent on downstream flow from the upstream reservoir complex. So salinity intrusion, this is something that they're already dealing with, and we expect that increases in temperature and potential decreases in precipitation during the Northeast monsoon season will likely lead to periods of even more reduced flow. The WEEP model was used to look at exactly what those scenarios could be, but then that information was integrated into this assessment to determine that exposure and sensitivity of the water supply complex was high, therefore having a high impact level of that threat on the complex. This summary is that, salinity intrusion reduces the quality of water, often impacts the plants to the level of shutdown, and these plants supply water for 3 to 4 million people in Colombo, as well as then impacting upstream because it forces discharge of water from the hydroelectric reservoirs, thus impacting the energy sector as well. Adaptive capacity was evaluated to be medium to address this, and overall vulnerability was high. So quickly, I'll just touch on the next part of the CAM process, which is the development of adaptation measures. So in the development of adaptation measures, we considered the whole critical infrastructure complex. So looking at both those smaller sector specific complexes, as well as interdependencies between infrastructure sectors. And all adaptation options were drawn from stakeholder input and include both structural and non-structural measures. So to continue building on our work on the hydropower complex, so this methodology looks at the hydropower complex, assesses the threats that might be most prevalent that came out of that previous analysis, the highest threats, and then looks at a whole range of adaptation options. So in this case, this is kind of a long list, an initial scoping of these adaptation options, but not a detailed assessment. The next step is to prioritize those, and this approach uses an evaluation of feasibility and effectiveness to determine priority. For this particular case study, for the level of work that we were doing, this is a pretty high level feasibility and effectiveness assessment. So the priority is then determined as those options which should be assessed in more detail for feasibility, detailed study for implementation. But this could also be an approach that you could do a detailed feasibility and effectiveness study at this level, and then prioritize for implementation. So the end of this pulled it back together to kind of a complex-wide or river basin-wide adaptation approach, one that recognizes co-benefits between adaptation options. So when we're evaluating the options, not just taking into account how it addresses the specific threat and specific complex, but also how that trickles out to other sectors and other infrastructure. Integrating a multi-criteria economic assessment, which we emphasize is done after the initial prioritization of adaptation options. And then developing a comprehensive adaptation action plan that integrates policy, institutional, regulatory, social, and ecosystem or nature-based approaches, along with specific infrastructure planning. So key lessons from this case study: community-based knowledge is really the foundation of this approach. We also need to think about dynamic, connected infrastructure that works between sectors. And the River Basin unit, we feel, is a really ideal unit for this. The overarching goals are to change how decisions are made around infrastructure, planning, policy, and investment, and to mainstream those decisions within socioeconomic and sector development planning, and not just look at designing singular assets. We also want to recognize that phased adaptation can take place in cyclical, iterative planning, that not everything has to be done at once when we're talking about these adaptation plans. Again, working with nature, which again reemphasizes why the watershed scale is important. Just recognizing that infrastructure is part of that wider landscape of natural systems and human uses. Recognizing the need for adaptive adaptation. Adaptation is not a one-time exercise, it's a continual process. So even our adaptation strategies need to be adaptive to changing conditions and new evidence. It's important to engage stakeholders through the consultation and communications plans throughout the project to help build capacity and understanding. And finally, this approach emphasizes that resilience comes out of broader systems thinking, that physical, ecological, financial, and social or institutional resilience are all connected and are crucial components of building resilience in critical infrastructure assets, systems, and the communities that depend on them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelsey, for presenting a very interesting talk on river basin approach to vulnerability assessment and building resilience in critical infrastructure using climate change adaptation methodology. Of course, the talk presented lots of lesson learned and also findings. I have seen there are questions already put forward by our audience. Those will be addressed during the panel session. The important lesson learned, we will reflect those back into the panel session. Since Kelsey, you started your talk, there are a few others, so I would like to again remind everybody that this is the fifth series of the webinar organized by UNESCO with AGWA and ICWAM. AGWA, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and International Center for Integrated Water Source Management, for the preparation of the global conference, Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches, scheduled to be held in November if the sanitary situation will improve. And today's webinar is addressing climate risk assessment on hydropower. So those who have joined after Kelsey started the talk. Now, from Sri Lanka, we will move to Nepal. A talk by Dr. Divas Basnet from Nepal Development Research Institute, who also he's a lead water and climate program, will present designing climate resilient hydropower sector case study of Nepal. Divas, you have the floor. So Kelsey, if you can come up in the, maybe there is a technical difficulties, apologies for that. So there are a few questions that have come that perhaps you can address. So one question is coming from our audience is, how can CAM, climate change adaptation um, methodology, can be applied in assessing wetland vulnerability? Kelsey.
Yeah, I think it's actually, like I mentioned, can be a very flexible approach to these. So we have a project right now in India where this is being applied in the wetland context. So it's just about first setting out what the scope of the assessment is, and then following along the same methodology. So figuring out what the threats to the system are, what all of the factors that go into that are, and then looking at the exposure and sensitivity of the system to those threats, potential future impacts, and developing adaptation options out of that. So I really think it's a flexible approach that certainly can be applied to a wetland scenario. And if you'd like more information on that, certainly happy to provide it.
Thank you, Kelsey. While we are waiting for Divas to upload his presentation, there is another question, Kelsey. What is the 5th and 95th percentile in the model? So there is a question from one of our audience.
Yeah. So that was essentially used to determine, so we had for this particular project, we looked at, we did a regional analysis looking at Southeast Asia and South Asia, including 14 countries total split between those two. We then did a national analysis on Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And then in each of those 3 countries had a case study within them. And different models were selected for each of those. So every model was plotted on those delta P, delta T graphs. The models that were first narrowed down to be most suitable to the particular geographic areas, and then plotted on the graphs. And then a bounding box of the 5th and 95th percentile was used to kind of look at what those extremes within that might be. This particular case study, the models selected were outside of that bounding box, but in some of the other case studies, they're more in line with that. And so we use the same approach for each of the case study model selections.
Thank you, Kelsey. I think there is some problem with the connection. So we will take few more questions while we are connecting with Divas from Nepal. So how is the level of threat defined? Example, medium, Is that based on expert stakeholder consultation or based on historical values? Kelsey.
A combination of both. And so that's kind of where all of this information comes together. So for a particular hazard or threat, we chose to rank everything in five values from very low to very high, and classify the data in the area in that range. And so that's how we looked at that. But again, it's so the factors that went into that are historical data, any other kind of risk or susceptibility analysis that had been done in country, as well as overlaying climate projections, and then the expert opinions as well, to integrate all of that together and come up with those values.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. We will now move to second presentation. Of course, there are questions. There are questions for you, but we will park those questions for the panel discussion, as our next presentation will talk about designing climate resilient hydropower sector by Divya Shrestha, who is a water source engineer and modeler with academic background in hydroinformatics. He's a senior research associate at NDRI, that is Nepal Development Research Institute, and he will talk about designing climate resilient hydropower sector, the case of Nepal. Divas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Anil. Yeah, I will continue with the presentation. Yeah, and the topic of our presentation is designing climate resilient hydropower sector, the case study of Nepal. Yeah, and Dr. Divas will join soon in the presentation. Yeah, this is the outline of our presentation. First, we discuss about the hydropower in Nepal, and then we go through the climate and hydrological regime that affects hydropower. Then we discuss about the rationale, methodology, and key messages that we have discovered, like we have find out in our research. So, giving a brief description about the hydropower in Nepal. We have the different natures of hydropower, that is ROR, run-of river, PROR, and the storage type, and they are scattered all over the different basins. And we have three different basins. One is the Kosi, and another is Gandaki, and the Karnali Basin. And all these basins are the part of Upper Ganges Basin. And in operation case, we have approximately 1200 megawatts capacity hydropower that are in operation, and the current plant projects are around 8,000 megawatt, and the future projects are even more than that. So this is basically about the hydropower in Nepal. And the most important thing when we talk about the hydropower sector is about the hydrological and the climate regime. And in case of the Nepalese context, the Indian summer monsoon is the most dominant hydrometeor factor that affects our climate regime. And the 80% of the rainfall occurs in the monsoon season of June, July, August, and September. And we have a different nature of the catchments. The nature of the catchments depends upon the snow fade and the rain fade, and the one that are between them. And in these catchment, there are four major hydrological processes. They are the rainfall runoff, and the glacier melt processes, snow melt processes, and the base flow processes. And depending upon the catchment type, one of these processes plays an important role. For example, in the Arun catchment, which is snow dominated catchment, the snow and melt contribution is about 30% of the annual flow, and that's even more higher in case of the pre-monsoon season. And in case of the rainfed, the monsoon regime and the monsoon rainfall is more important. And altogether, in this Nepalese catchment, the geohazards like landslide dam outburst flood, glacial lake outburst floods, and flash floods they are also very important to consider for hydropower sector. And talking about the rationale, while we were going through the conducting this resource phase, we have like kind of discussion whether to go for the top down or the bottom up, and then at the same time we are having a the research from the World Bank of the bottom-up approach, and the beauty of the bottom-up approach is that it's system-driven. So it's we thought it's okay. Let's go to the bottom-up because it assesses the system vulnerability, and it's not driven by the climate-driven case. So we took the bottom-up approach in this study. This is the research that we did in 2016, 15-16. And we addresses we had the following challenges that we have a very highly variable topography in the Nepalese catchments, and that the future changes are very highly uncertain, and we have to plan for the current actions for the future risks. So what we need is a robust system, and and we need to be prepared for the range of possible futures. And I would like to discuss some the types of uncertainty that we have. The most important uncertainty in the future is the climate change uncertainty. And as we can see that the most of the models show that there is an increase in the monsoon precipitation, but there is no agreement on the winter precipitation and also on the pre-monsoon and post-monsoon. And there is a wide variation of the level of warming with the glacier melt and snow melt across different types of catchment. And in future, like it's projected that the future extremes are going to increase, and it impacts on the sedimentation, floods, and landslides. But the magnitude depends upon the catchment responses. Yeah, and that's why it's like it brings a kind of uncertainty on that. And other to that, this kind of climate related uncertainty, we have other regulatory uncertainties like policy tariff that depends upon the government and the government policies, as well as we have different project variables like cost, time overrun, and discount rates, etc. So these are the uncertainties that we have to deal with.
Dibesh, if you don't mind, can I take over?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Let me just share. Or Dibesh, can you I just ask you to go, you can share from your side, then I will just talk. Okay.
Sure, sir.
Okay, I'm so sorry that I was a little bit, there was some technical hitch. As Dibesh just explained, the different rationale for the methodology that we have used, I would just now like to talk about the specific methodology we used for our study. And this is very similar to what Kelsey just now presented earlier, but we have taken a more sectoral approach. And we've also taken the three main steps of for our climate change adaptation or impact assessment study. The first one is the vulnerability assessment using the bottom-up climate risk assessment methodology, and which was already the bottom-up approach has been discussed in the previous webinar, so I will not go over it, and Dibesh must have explained that too. And basically what we did was, as expected, we started by defining the performance indicators and thresholds that were relevant to the stakeholders. So we went to the stakeholder. It's a stakeholder-driven approach where we had a stakeholder meeting, and then we decided on what were the relevant indicators. Then we looked at the current climate. How did the performance of the hydropower projects and the sector as a whole, as a system, performed? Then, and we did a stress test for that. And then using the results of the stress test and the learnings from the stress test, we did a assessment of the full risks to the full ensemble of future climate. And as was already mentioned, we looked at the range of possible plausible climate cases, which were not guided by the GCM per se, but we took information from the GCM. We had to look at the GCMs to see what would be the range of possible climate changes. So this was the climate risk assessment part. And then we went to and identified the adaptation options using an adaptation pathways approach. I will talk about that a little later. And finally, I mean, we needed to do a institutional analysis, assessment mapping. Then while doing the institutional analysis, we looked at the barriers to adaptation and what would be the entry points that would be required to make adaptation implementable, successful. Next, please, Deves. Yeah, okay. So talking about the stakeholder-defined performance indicators, I mean, there were different types of stakeholders, from the government to the private sector to communities and lending agencies. So each of these stakeholders had their own specific performance indicator. I mean, these are very specific because if you go to a developer, they want to know how would my project economics change? What would be the impact of future climate on my rate of return, on my net present value benefits? So, but if I went to a policymaker, they were more interested at the system level in the performance. How would the hydropower sector perform? How would would it be able to meet the reliability, quality standards of power supply to the thing? What would be the cost of it? What would be, because they want to minimize the cost. Whereas the private developer is looking at maximizing revenue, for example. But having said that, all these different indicators can be grouped into basically in terms of when you look at the resiliency of these indicators, we could look at it from a safety point of view. And when you safety, it's basically structural safety, dam safety, and other things. And look at it from a security point of view. When I talk about security, I'm talking about water, energy, electricity, supply security. And finally, of course, economics is something that one has to look at. But this has to be looked at in two perspectives. One, at the project level, other at the system level or a sector level. Next, please, Dinesh. The next slide. This is the stress test we did, no? And we use different models. And first, we use a stochastic weather generator that was developed in-house in NDRI, and you can visit our website. It's based on papers by University of Massachusetts Amherst, Professor Casey Brown and his co-authors have done this. And we use that to sort of see how the climate, when you change the climate parameter, then we generated a data series. Then we had the hydrological model to look at the catchment response. And we look at catchment response in 2 or 3 different aspects. One is, of course, the flow. How would the hydrograph, the flow duration curve change, like the top figure on the right? Also, we needed to look at the sediment changes. What would be the changes in concentration of sediment? Because any sediment concentration ppm of, let's say, 3,000 to 5,000 parts per million of sediment, that would make the operation of run-of-the-river projects not possible because it would damage the turbines. So it's important to look at not just the flow component, but also the sediment component. And of course, we also looked at the extreme floods and other events as well. Then based on the catchment response information we had, then we ran through a hydropower model. This hydropower model consisted of several ones, like one was for run-of-the-river projects, the other was for reservoir projects, reservoir operation model. Then we also did a system expansion model, a model using WASP, called WASP. How would the investment planning of power system select which projects would, what is the combination project, what would be the long-run marginal cost, and what would be the mix in terms of run-of-the-river storage. So that model was also there. And finally, we looked at the economic model where the vulnerability domain, the response surface, is shown. And with changes in precipitation and temperature shown in X and Y axis, we looked at the financial indicator. We could look at the flow also. We've also got models for the flow surfaces, as was also shown by the previous presenter at the base. Next, please. And then based on our vulnerability assessment, there were several key messages, findings that we found. One was Nepal's current climate and hydrological variability is itself a major challenge for Nepal's hydro sector. But I mean, we have a very variable climate, as was shown earlier in the earlier slides. But this variability was different in different catchments. Smaller catchments had higher variability of flows. So this higher variability would have, if climate change would further exacerbate these variability, then this would be a problem. Rain-fed catchments had more variability than the snow-fed catchments. Similarly, I mean, storage projects obviously are able to handle the variability better than run-of-river projects. And also some catchments had higher sediment loads concentration. So depending on the location, the type of the project, the catchment characteristics, the variability was different. And then the vulnerability to climate and other changes was also different. So the figures you see here is for a snow-fed run-of-river project, for a rain-fed run-of-river project, the range of variability is different. Similarly, for a storage project, you see that a storage project with higher live storage capacity is able to basically in the dry season regulate the flow a lot. But the problem on the figure on the bottom left, on the extreme left, you can see that there's a lot of secondary energy, because we don't really capture all the water that is available. Next, please. Yeah, and the next one, as we also rightly, TBS must have mentioned earlier, that the greatest impact of climate change in the catchments of Nepal, in the Himalayan catchments, were more to do with climate-induced hazard rather than water availability. So in general, the financial performance of the hydropower projects, different types of hydropower projects in different catchments, basically under the current tariff and the PPA rates, they perform within the performance threshold for the projected change. So the water availability is a concern, but it's not an immediate concern. In the long term, that could be a concern. But the immediate concern, immediate risk is the geohazards that on sediment, on extreme floods, on cloughs, LDOs. Two pictures you see on the right, this is of a Bhotekosi hydroelectric project, which was affected about 3 or 4 years ago by a clough event in Tibet. So this was damaged more by the debris that the clough event brought. And the project was out of operation for almost 3 years, and it just recently been rehabilitated. Obviously, I mean, at the project level, they had taken precautions, but anyway, that is a case study, which I think Dibesh will talk about a little later. We also did a mapping of the glacier lakes, which are the dangerous lakes, and how close were the hydropower projects to these dangerous glacier lakes, and what would, if they burst, what would be the risk to this? So depending on the distance of it, the risk is higher. If you are closer, the risk is high. Although the run out of these glacier lakes can, extend pretty far too. Next, please. Dibesh, next, please. The previous one. Okay, yeah. So the impact of hydropower projects of climate change is, we call it's additional to other factors. As in the short term, again, I repeat, current variability, current climate-induced geohazard itself is a big challenge. And the institutional and the regulatory issues, the uncertainty on tariff, the market, the construction cost, the project financing, the risk of delays is more critical. But in the future, after 10, 15, 20 years, with the projects coming in the future after 2030s, the impact of climate change would be much higher. But we have time to plan for it. We should start with preparation and action today, with more data, with more monitoring. And the sketch you see on the right is a stream of benefit and cost. The bottom two will show you that the first option is, you want to spend a little extra in the beginning, adapt in design, or you want to wait for a later period to make these adaptation changes? Do you want to learn now and act later? So this was sometimes that our adaptation strategies were based on these issues. Next, please. Yeah, and finally, we also did a system study, a power system investment planning, a system expansion study. And we noticed that the projects are designed under the current regime, the pricing, market, regulatory frame. And the figure you see top right, you see the types of run-of-the-river projects. The x-axis covers the ratio of dry season energy and wet season energy. So you can see that the light blue and the blue ones are projects that are designed for lower dependable flows, exceedance probability. So they generate a lot of energy in the wet season compared to the dry season. And this is based on the current policy. Okay. Now, if this policy changes, the design parameters will also change. And the bottom right figure shows the storage projects. Mind you, the storage projects in Nepal have storage capacity, which is just seasonal storage capacity. It is less than the monsoon runoff, for example. As you can see, most of the storage projects in Nepal are designed for live storage capacity, which can store only up to 50% of the total runoff in the wet season, which means even if there is any fluctuation in the monsoon pattern, it will not impact the energy generation so much. Of course, the secondary energy might be changing, but it's not a big issue. So these are, nuances of adaptation, of vulnerability that we have to experience, and it varies from project to project, from the location and other things. And the bottom left figure is the expansion planning study we did with and without climate change. The current storage capacity mix, 10% storage and about 80% ROR, and the other remaining other being the rate, will have to change. Now, it will change in the future to almost equal 47 of ROR, 47% of storage. Of course, the energy generation from ROR will be larger, but the storage project will provide about 20% of the total energy generation. But the storage project has the capacity of flexibility with integration with variable renewable energy like solar and wind. So this has got a lot of advantages as well. Next, please. Yeah, so now we come to the second step of, based on the climate risk assessment that we carried out, then we looked at we identified the adaptation options. No, and this, we noticed that the adaptation has to be different for, it has to be sort of by location, by the type, by the catchment, and for current project, existing project, and immediate projects for the immediate future, and for the long term. So we said that first we have to address existing climate variability, and let us start with low or no regret options, which brings immediate economic benefits and which will automatically build resilience for future changes. Similarly, for projects in the planning stage, we have to prepare, allow for reductions in future risks. So we have to start with risk screening, low cost of over-design, flexible design, and robustness-based design, provide greater robustness. And for projects in the future, which has very high uncertainty, we have to do an iterative process where monitoring program, iterative portfolios has to be considered, and we have to learn over time. So this is what we call the adaptation pathways approach that we have recommended. Next, please. Finally, institution matters because although there are a lot of adaptation vulnerability at the project level, the vulnerability at the system level, at the sector level, and at a river basin level, as the previous speaker mentioned, has to be done. But we have to look at the roles of stakeholders and their exposures. So what are the barriers? Barriers are many, but I would just like to highlight that the policy and institutional landscape, the right policy and institution is required. What are the entry points? So we have to mainstream adaptation with changing the institutional and policy landscape. We have to do policy interventions that addresses vulnerabilities to specific context, location, size, and type. Then we have to include climate in the existing activity. Let's not start something very new. Let's look at the design guidelines. Our study, in a way, has contributed to some changes, And the risk screening has been involved, but there is much more to be done. Let's start with the EIA process, how climate can be incorporated. Let's look at the dam safety guidelines. Let's look at risk sharing between the government and the private sector. Finally, we have to invest to learn. So more monitoring research is needed. And I come to the last thank you slide. And thank you, sorry, there was some technical hitch up, and I'm very happy that Dibes started the presentation in my absence. Thank you very much. If you want more information about our work, please visit our website, and the tool that we have developed, as well as the various reports of our study are given there. Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Divas and Dives, for making a very interesting presentation, which really touch upon many issues. And one of the things that I would like to quote that Divas says, the impact of climate change on hydropower sector is additional to other factors. Of course, there are lots of questions that is coming from the audience, but I would like to now invite all the panelists to come forward. Please open your camera. Before we go on a question and answer, I would like to give floor to Dr. Peter Rogers. He's an expert on integrated water source management at different spatial scale with emphasis on water for food issues, climate change decision support system, simulating model in combination with data mining and remote sensing. Peter has about 20 years of experience working in the Netherlands and many parts of the world. So perhaps, Peter, you can complement of the previous talk given by Kelsey briefly before I start a panel session. Peter.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Anil. And I really would like to focus a little bit on one of the major issues which was discussed during both presentation, and that's this what we call this climate response services. And many of you might be aware of that. That of course the problem is always that the climate models are not projecting one future but many futures, and we try to explain it by the changes in precipitation and the changes in temperature, as was shown by both speakers. And my big challenge always is, if I'm doing projects, whether it's hydropower or water supply, to convince the stakeholders not using only 1 or 2 GCMs. I think from the research side we are doing quite okay, but the big challenge is to convince stakeholders not taking only 1 or 2 GCMs, but take the entire range. And I think the main topic to cover that is not only looking at one particular component, like here, hydropower production, but trying to make many of those climate response services, both for water supply, both for hydropower, both for the impact of nature. And my experience is a little bit, if we are not going only to one sector, and I think Kelsey explained that very well, but trying to go to the entire sector, to the entire approach, then that enables us to convince stakeholders not going for only 1 or 2 GCMs, but for the entire range. And I think that's very open for discussions, how to make sure that stakeholders are taking this approach. So looking forward to further discussions. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Indeed, not only one set of GCM, but as many set of GCM as we have a possibility to see to identify climate risk factor. I want to go to second panelist, Dives. Would you like to briefly tell the audience about the geohazard component in this work undertaken very briefly, because we also need to answer to the questions coming from the audience. Yeah. Dives.
Thank you, Anil sir. Actually, when we talk about the Nepalese context, the geohazards are very important. I would like to give some examples in the past of the past events. In 1993, there was a cloud burst in the Kelani storage project, the only storage project in Nepal. And in that cloud burst, 540 millimeter of rainfall occurred in a single night. And that brings a sediment load of 5 million cubic meter, which is approximately 6% of the total storage of the hydropower. And if you compare with the dead load, it's 42% of the dead load. So such a massive amount in one night time like it's totally affected the Kelani hydropower project. And there is another geohazard that occurred in 2016 with a GLOF in the Tibet. And because of that GLOF, the Bhotekoshi hydropower project was substantially damaged. And in 2014, there was a heavy rainfall, and it induced a landslide in the Sunkosi River. And because of that landslide, it blocked the Sunkosi River. And after it outburst, it destroyed the gates of the Sunkosi hydropower project, as well as it inundated the powerhouse for some time. So these are the geohazards that we have to consider while doing our climate risk assessment. And another thing about these geohazards is that it's not only about the water quantity, but it's also about the sediment and the debris flow it brings, because the most of the damages are done by the sediment and the debris flow rather than just the water that we normally incorporate in our design. So that's that I want to highlight. Yeah, thank you.
Of course, the glacier lake outburst floods recently we have also seen in India. Perhaps that was still discussion going around. So that brings additional uncertainty. Now we gather some questions, and I would like to invite all the panelists to reflect on a question that we generalize. And I would like to invite, starting from Kelsey, and Divesh and Peter and Divesh, your view on, let's say, based on the question that we have received, question on how best to respond to climate change are mostly answered as adapting to change or building resiliency. From understanding the risk and being prepared to face the consequences, the design parameter, protocol, and processes have been and still remain the same with or without climate change. Do you think any specific changes are warranted in actual component design? And if yes, what changes are prescribed, and can you point out to some details that can be useful to practicing engineers? Let's start with Kelsey. It's a long question. If you want, I can also summarize once again.
No, I think it's fine. It's a great question. I think that the level of analysis that we did for our project is really more, in some ways, at the planning level, which as an engineer is sometimes frustrating. But I think what we see more and more is that building resilience really does need that institutional layer of stakeholders who are engaged in those multi-sector efforts, that are talking to each other, that are looking at ways to work together. And I think that's kind of a first step. So that doesn't answer your question at all in terms of specific engineering measures, but I think that this is kind of a first layer in developing that.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. Divesh, would you like to respond to that question?
Okay, I don't know if I fully understood the question, but I think from what I understood, I think we have to look at two things, first of all. One is, I think there were some other questions related to that, so it will answer that, is, as I mentioned, the current climate variability in Nepal and perhaps in Sri Lanka too, is itself is a challenge. So if you prepare yourself, if you make your system, sector, project resilient to the current variability, you are already preparing yourself for the future. And when we went to the stakeholders, the private sector asked me, Divesh, give me what should be my design discharge. My 1:1,000 year return period flood is 2,500 with climate change, what it will be. And as we all know, these GCMs cannot really tell you what it would be. So we don't have the confidence in giving you the number. So I told, well, there is big uncertainty. But I think it was, actually, I quote Professor Casey Brown, I heard him speak once. He says, why don't you flip that question? You should basically ask the question, what will happen if a flood of this magnitude came? Is it a risk worth taking? And what is the plausibility of such that event happening? So I think that is what the bottom-up approach is teaching you. We have to look at the range of things, and we have to look at the vulnerability domain. I would also like to add that the historical data a lot of people have started, and again, I quote Professor Upmanu Lal, who it just resonated to what I think, but I heard him speak in one of the things. He says, a lot of people are saying historical data is useless because the future will be different from history. What he said was, that is a little bit stupid thing to say, because we can learn from historical data. So using the data, we look at the variation of this climate and the impacts and other things. Then using weather generators and other tools, try to see, you get the range of things. But you have to look, the historical data will tell you what are the drivers that impact glacier melt. What are the drivers that impact snow melt? So based on the historical data, you can learn for the future also. So that's what I think. Thank you.
Well, Divas, I would like to pose a counter question. Yes, of course, we need to learn from historical perspective. When we talk about stationarity is dead, when the past is no longer relevant to the future, of course, you can learn, but if it is not relevant, how you can really rely on your learning in introducing, let's say, forecast model or whatever?
Yeah. Well, for that, I would like to say that the stochastic weather generator we talked about in the beginning. I mean, if you look at and DBase has done a very good, my colleague DBase has done the coding, it's available in our website, it's available in other places. You basically tweak that statistics, you tweak the mean, you tweak the standard deviation, you took the third moment and try to generate a new, it's a completely different series, but you use the data available from the historical data. I mean, like for example, if it was raining 5 days in 1 month, then what will happen if it rains 10 days? No, the statistics is changing. You are not considering stationarity. What I'm saying is you use that data to change the statistics, to question the stationarity of the data. And weather generators are the tools to do that, for example. And there are other tools that can be done. Devesh, you would like to add something to it?
Yes, sir. Actually, when we talk about the future, like we have to consider the changes in the extremes, and those kind of things can be like somehow addressed in the weather generator, like changing the transition probabilities, and then we can generate a kind of future climate traces or scenarios where we have a data. Where we generate the data that with the different properties than with the current climate by tweaking the characteristics. And that's how like we do the climate stress test by feeding those changed or altered climate data into the model. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to bring now Peter. Peter, would you like to take this question? How you balance between high uncertainty and long-term planning of infrastructure in terms of high cost?
Yeah, that's of course always a big challenge how to balance that. I think also the previous discussions on climate change, and sometimes I see we are at the kind of turning point that climate change should be much more integrated into the entire design. And we are doing a lot of climate risk assessments for projects, for the World Bank and for ADB. And quite often we come to the conclusion that it's not only the climate, but there are of course so many other factors which are there. And sometimes I compare it a little bit with the gender issue, which was of course very important for the last 30 years. And it got a lot of attention, and now it's more or less integrated into everything. And I've got the feeling that with climate change, we are on the same approach now. And maybe if I can say a couple of things about the Green Climate Fund. I happen to be one of the supporters in supporting the Green Climate Fund with their project analysis. And the Green Climate Fund was having quite some big problems in finding suitable projects because they are only allowed to finance projects which are clearly climate related. So there were so many proposals where people say, okay, we've got big problems and the climate is probably one of the problems. And then the GCF was not allowed to fund them because it must be only climate related. And I know that the GCF and especially the board of GCF is now in a kind of transition where they say, okay, the simple approach of just looking at climate models and the impact of climate and responses to that is probably not sufficient. And we really have to go to an entire resilience approach where we are saying, if the entire system is more resilient to whatever damages there are, then the system is also more resilient to the climate. And I think what Divas was presenting was also very a clear example of that, you know, saying that the climate is one component and it's very difficult to go away from the other sectors. Yeah, so that's a little bit a broad answer, but I think that also helps very much in dealing this issue of uncertainty and 90% and 95%, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So clearly, I think we are at the point where the climate is just one of the major components and very difficult to put it away from the other hazards.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a global change driver that needs to be considered besides climate change. Otherwise, the society cannot be built resilient. I want to have a follow-up question for you and Kelsey. Any specific multi-criteria analysis tool you, if you can recommend? So just quickly, I mean, I want to take as many questions as possible. Both Peter and Kelsey, if you can come in.
No, I don't have a specific tool to recommend. We did a general, we had an economist on the team that did a general multi-criteria analysis looking at a huge range of factors, but not a specific tool. So Peter, if you have more comments on that, please.
No specific tool. Quite often I just use Excel with scoring card method, which is straightforward.
You know, there is an interesting question, and I think we have also encountered this this phenomena, but particularly in terms of hydropower development. So dams are sediment traps, but that can also flush out. The question is, dams are sediment traps. Apart from landslide, climate change will also change the sediment regime of river. Whether those were considered in CAM?
I'm going to defer over to Peter again, just because of the modeling component. But sediment at this time wasn't considered a huge component into those models.
Yeah, maybe I can refer to a current study we are doing in Gabon, where we are looking at hydropower, and there the focus is really on catchment surfaces, because in this particular project a lot of tropical forest will be cut down for this project. And we came to the conclusion that not only cutting this forest is a big issue, but because of it's an unspoiled area so far, many people are going into this area and they are going to work in the forest, and there will be some settlements, etc. And the sediment load, which is expected because of this additional erosion, is a huge factor. And I think the main issue is not only looking at let's say trying to trap these sediment, but trying to avoid, of course, that there will be erosion. So make pretty sure that catchment protection measures are in place. And we all know, you know, that 1 square meter of road can have 100 times more erosion than 1 hectare of forest. So we really have to try not only trying to trap the sediments, but for sure make sure that you are starting at the source. And what Kelsey mentioned for the study in Kelani, we didn't include it, but I think we've got some wonderful tools to analyze that. And there is, of course, something which is called the SWOT model, and also the WEEP model we just, which was discussed by Kelsey and we used for the study, now also has an erosion component. So many people are familiar with the WEEP model because it's an integrated one where hydropower is included and erosion is also included now in the latest version.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, there are very good success stories of erosion control now. And we have recently seen the studies of Yellow Ribbon, actually 1,000 years of erosion control measure, a book which is recently published by UNESCO also. I want to go to, again, to Divas and Dives. This is basically a question related to approach. How does your approach of vulnerability assessment differ from the general risk assessment framework, which is defined in IPCC, in which risk is a function of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure? Divas.
Actually, there's not much difference, basically, which is correct. So when you talk about the performance of any indicator, we are basically looking at what is the hazard, what is the change in precipitation, temperature, and flood and flows. That's the hazard. Now, what is the vulnerability? What is the design, the policy framework that the project sits in? What's the so what are the socioeconomic? If it's for a hydropower project, it's more technical vulnerability. What is the design standard used? What are the operation policy? Also, these can also change. And exposure is, of course, what is the location? As I mentioned, when you said location was important, the catchment type was important. So there are some catchments with high sediment, some projects near glacier lakes, some projects which are mainly rain-fed and more variable, some projects which are snow-fed, less variable. So, and of course, divided by capacity, as Kelsey. So actually, it's just a different way of presenting it, but I think the risk framework standard is valid, is applicable there too.
Yeah,
I also agree with Dr. Divas. What basically is like when we look into the climate risk assessment, if we look it carefully, we can always break down into the risk component, that is the vulnerability, exposure, and hazard. So all these things combined in a different form or manifest in different form, but actually in essential, they are always there. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I want to continue, and particularly when you said climate change on hydropower sector is additional to other factors. There is a question: what change can be made to current policies and financial modalities to encourage hydropower developers to account for climate change-induced disaster risk in hydropower project planning? Maybe Divas, you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for this is something that I miss saying that. If you remember, when we recommended the entry points on changes and policy thing, and I also talked about risk sharing. Some of these watershed level check dams, water level interventions, early warning systems, protocol between different cascades in the river basin level planning cannot be done by an individual hydropower developer. So the government has to come in. So similarly, that's one example of a government policy, a river basin level intervention policy that will take care of a river basin level impact, cumulative impact. The other thing also I would like to mention is the design standards. I mean, if you see the design standards in Nepal, I mean, it varies. A World Bank project has a very high design standard, whereas the private developers with very short-term interest, 10, 50, they want to get their money back in the next 15 to 20 years. So they want to minimize cost, maximize revenue. So government policy regulator has to fix the standards. And also, I'll give you another example. The PPA, the power purchase agreement, it has a clause of penalty. If you do not supply a certain committed amount of energy, you have to pay a penalty for that. And now with climate change, some years you have a good harvest, a good energy, some years you don't have that. So the policy has to be flexible on such matters also. So I think there's a lot of scope for policy intervention. And this is the argument we've been having. There are project level interventions that every designer, planner, developer has to do. But there are system level, sector level interventions at the policy and institutional landscape that the regulator, the policymakers needs to do. That's what I think. Thank you.
Kelsey, you want to contribute based on the experience from Sri Lanka?
Sure. I'll just add briefly to build on what Divas said. For example, in the Kelani Basin in particular, I think there's an opportunity because of the relationship that already exists, for example, between the water supply, companies and the hydropower operators, where in some cases they have to ask those that are running the hydropower operators to release water downstream to make sure there's enough for the water intake. So just an example of that kind of multi-sector development. So working one on that, and then opportunities, for example, for again, more ecosystem-based approaches. So looking at what would restoring ecological flow mandates look like in this river that created a sufficient flow of water to supply the basin and keep out salinity intrusion. How can hydropower be supplemented during those times? What other kind of watershed protection measures, as mentioned, to reduce soil erosion and to create a healthier ecosystem overall that then benefits the entire watershed. I think those are some of the higher level policies that we advocate for.
Thank you. And based on your both presentation, it's a question, general question to all the panelists. How did you select the indicator for sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity for assessment of vulnerability? Who wants to come first? It's a sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity for assessment of vulnerability. The criteria.
I can try to give it a first try. I've never been very much, how to put it, enthusiastic about all these terminology. We need them and they help us a little bit, but so many people have different understanding and different meanings about those terms, and those terms are changing, and there were a lot of questions about those terms. And it's a little bit dangerous to say, but I would say maybe they are a little bit from the period when we were not very good in quantitative analysis. We were always having lack of data, lack of models. So then we thought, okay, let's go to a kind of framework we can discuss with people. But I think which was presented by Kelsey, and I think especially by Divas, you know, that at the moment we are very good in doing all kinds of quantitative analysis. So instead of going through all the steps, we get already at the end, we get directly the answer on the internal rate of return. So in fact, all those factors are already in our quantitative analysis. If we are running our models already have impact, exposure, vulnerability, sensitivity, all those things are already built into our models. So it's a little bit easy to go directly because all those things are included in the models. At the same time, that's also a kind of small risk, because then, of course, we don't want to lose our stakeholders, which are still very much thinking in those kind of things. And also, if you're looking at adaptation mitigation, you need those issues. But I think both presentations clearly made it very clear that we can use the quantitative and the qualitative analysis to make sure that we've got the correct answers and that we are not losing the stakeholders.
Thank you. Now we have one last question, which is sort of, to me, it's a more like a socioeconomic interpretation, social interpretation, I would say. But please give very short answer, not more than 30 seconds, so that I can pass the floor to our to Will Logan to say a few words and close the session. Can you clarify the difference between resistance and resilience within climate change? Let's start with Divas. Very clear and short answer. Can you clarify the difference between resistance and resilience within climate change?
Resistance is reactive to any pressure, but when we talk about resilience, we plan for it. So that's my understanding. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Kelsey?
Yeah, I agree with Dibesh. I think the resilience is more looking at that flexible framework to be able to work within and plan for.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, it reflects a little bit on my previous answer. You know, I'm not so much in terminology because sometimes it's very difficult. People have different understanding.
Divas?
I agree with all three speakers. I would just like to add, as a water resources engineer system analysis, we learned a lot about reliability, resiliency, adaptability, vulnerability. So I think I also take it as a more general term of how a system is able to perform in even in cases of external stresses.
Well, thank you very much for your intervention and answer to the questions posed by audience. There are a couple of questions remaining to be answered. We will get back to you through email, but you know, this is a process. As I said, it's a fifth of the series of webinar. We had one on agriculture, urban water, now hydropower. We'll continue to organize. So please join us, please submit your interest. And with that, I would like to thank all the panelists and speakers for their excellent presentation, and our colleague who organized this over the month of time. So over to you, Will Logan.
Yes, sir. I think this is this is the fifth in our series, and it's so interesting to me that each project is different. You know, we've had droughts and floods. We've had urban and agriculture. We've had monsoons and sediment and saltwater intrusion. What's interesting to me, the ones we heard today, the emphasis on hazards, landslides, and the impacts of topography. I think the another very interesting aspect was the impact of snow and ice in the Nepalese examples, and I think when we talk about global climate models. The combination of high topography and the issue of whether precipitation is going to come in terms of rain or snow and when it's going to melt, I think that only underscores the importance of the bottom-up approach. I was heartened to hear that historical data is still useful. As a geologist, that's very important to me. I was also heartened to see that Divas and Dibesh were able to create their own weather generator. I think that's the fact that there's a recipe out there that you can use to create these things in your own kitchen. I think that's a really good point there. And then finally, to underscore the points made about mainstreaming climate into development or water resources planning, that seems like a key to me. So those are some of the key points that I took out of today's presentations. And with that, I'd like to thank folks for being here, and I'd turn it back to Anil for any final remarks from UNESCO.
Yes, thank you very much, Will. Thank you all the panelists, speakers for your excellent remark, and thanks to the audience. Because of your interest, we've been running this series of webinar. We will continue to run as a preparation for global conference, Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches. We have a dedicated website in UNESCO. If you go over there, you will find previous videos of the previous webinar, as well as this one with all the PowerPoint presentation. It will take 1 or 2 days to be uploaded, but you will find this. So please continue to follow us in our UNESCO website and contribute, and also send us your interest. And hopefully, if everything goes well, we would like to welcome you here in Paris in November for the Climate Resilient Water Management Global Conference, depending on the sanitary situation. With that, thanks again to AGWA and ICWAM for partnering in this effort, and UNESCO colleagues for supporting to organize the event. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, stay safe, and take care.